Okay, I'm going to wait maybe about a minute more, and then if I pause, it's because I'm letting people in, but I want to be respectful of your time. Okay, people are still trickling in, so I want to be respectful of your time, but I'm going to give them maybe a minute or two. All right, as people are trickling in, I'm going to progress the slide one so that those of you who want to check in, you can. So it's not required, you don't have to, but in the chat, if you wanted to comment your name and your children's ages and what province you adopted from and what state you reside in, it would just be cool to see if we've got some connections in here.
Hmm? No? No? It just never showed up? I guess so. It's interesting.
That's pretty cool. So if you guys want to just kind of look at the chat, see what connections you've got to people in here. And I cannot be moderating the chat as I present. So at the end and at the break, I'll glance at the chat and see what's going on. Okay. So I am going to start, and then if I do pause again, I'm letting somebody in. Just some housekeeping. I know you guys are all going to be respectful and compassionate for everybody who's attending. Just also recognition of the uniqueness of all adoptee circumstances. So not all adoptee circumstances are positive, not all are negative. So just leaving that space for every experience. You can absolutely ask questions in the chat during the presentation. I'm the kind of person who I forget what my questions are if I don't get them out. So please write your questions in the chat if you need to. And I will be doing a Q&A portion at the end. And so I will answer as many as I can at the end, and also I'll answer live questions at the end. And if you just mute yourselves, that would be awesome. And during the Q&As, you can unmute and ask questions because I really encourage it. Okay, so what's included in this presentation? So I am combining personal lived experience with research trainings and my professional experience. So I really wanted, in case you wanted a copy of these slides, I really wanted to keep it organized. So anything that is in colored boxes, purple or green, are my personal insights. I also have I have both of my wonderful supervisors here on this Zoom call. They're awesome. They are licensed clinical social workers here in Georgia. One is Ann Pearl and one is Kaylin Broom. And Kaylin is a wonderful adoption competent therapist here in Atlanta, Georgia. And so she's going to be helping me out with some of the sections in this presentation. And so this webinar is to be considered a compassion-driven educational tool. I'm doing it because I love it. And it's not to be considered a CEU or a therapeutic relationship, which I know you all get, but I just like to put that in there. So who am I? So I am Lyla. I'm a licensed master social worker here in Georgia. I was adopted from Anhui Province. Sorry, I'm letting people in. I was adopted from Anhui Province at 3 months old, and I'm currently residing in Alpharetta, Georgia. So something I'll touch on throughout the presentation is I did grow up in a predominantly white community, and so I had a lot of issues with finding my identity and also wanting to fit in at the same time. For education, I went to Furman for 2 years and then decided maybe I'd go to law school. So I transferred to Alabama to major in criminal justice. I ended up going to law school, not liking it, and becoming a therapist. I went to Louisiana State University for my master's degree. My experience has been a generalist internship at Walden Behavioral Care, which is an eating disorder facility here in Atlanta, Georgia. They also have locations across the United States. I then went and did my advanced internship at Creek and Alpharetta Counseling, which is actually the private practice that I'm at today. Currently, I see adolescents, adults, and couples. And I do have some certifications and certified mindfulness informed professional, anxiety informed professional, and child and adolescent trauma informed professional.
Why did I lose her?
It's okay. So now that I've kind of introduced myself, actually, Kaylin, do you want to do a brief introduction?
Sure. I am Kaylin Broom, pronounced she, her. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in Midtown Atlanta, Georgia, specializing in grief, trauma, and adoption. I, this last year, completed the Center for Adoption Support and Education's Training and Adoption Competency, which is a accredited certificate program. And so that curriculum will be informing my portions of the presentation today.
Thank you, Kaylin. So I kind of want to begin the presentation with just talking about adoption from China. So since 1980, over 140,000 children from China have been adopted internationally, meaning to other different countries. So this adoption also includes various countries around the world, with the United States being one of the largest recipients. And then since 1980, approximately 90,000 children from China have been adopted by families in the United States. And I was one of them, as were your children. And you, for the adult adoptees on here. So the unseen trauma. So prenatal trauma looks at how stress and traumatic experiences during pregnancy can shape a child's development, especially in the context of international adoption from China. This is just extremely important to understand. So prenatal trauma is exposure to stressors or traumatic events during pregnancy. Cortisol is the hormone associated with stress that can affect birth mother and baby. And cortisol transfer is elevated maternal cortisol that can cross over the placenta. And when a mother experiences high levels of stress, the hormone cortisol can affect the baby. So an emotional awareness. So before we dive into the aspect of prenatal trauma, let's look at another side of prenatal trauma, which is emotional awareness and connection between the birth mother and baby. So not only is there an aspect of prenatal trauma, but there's also correlation that's been studied about the emotional awareness that a baby has in the birth mother's stomach. So 2 examples, which I posted about, are at 30 weeks, the baby can start developing short-term memory, and at 34 weeks, long-term memory develops. So they can retrieve information about 4 weeks later. So for example, familiar songs and stories. Another 2 examples are studies that have been done on babies where the mother is singing, and it's reported that when the babies hear the mom singing, they move and they physically respond to the mother's voice. And then if there's fighting, if there's conflict, if the mother's voice is raised, or if the parents are fighting, the babies can react by flinching or becoming visibly distressed on a sonogram. Something also to note is it's been researched and discovered that a baby in the womb can feel emotional rejection. So that can lead to insecure attachment style when the baby is born later down the road during childhood development. So this is why we care so much now in the United States about asking those pregnant to practice self-care, read to the baby, practice mindfulness, because it is important, that developmental connection. Prenatal trauma. So prenatal trauma can lead to increased cortisol levels in birth mothers, and substance abuse rates vary based on country, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, which is something that Kaylin's going to talk about. So this is why we in the United States, again, try to stress mindfulness. And so I want to kind of turn back to the prenatal trauma and how that does affect a child's development. And I'm going to let Kaylin take over this part.
Thank you. And I forgot to say, actually, during my intro, I apologize. I will have to hop off a couple minutes before 4 for a client. So as Lyla was saying, everything that happens to the biological mother or, birthing partner happens to the fetus as well, because of them living through that experience as well, whether they remember it explicitly in a way that they can recall, like I went to the store yesterday and I saw my neighbor, or in more of a felt sense way, that implicit memory that Lyla mentioned. That is one piece of it. So if you see the impact of chronic stress, so if you think about birth parents, but also international adoption in particular, chronic stress, poverty, substance use, homelessness, domestic violence, all of these things in the duration of the pregnancy set the foundation for the baby's brain development, nervous system development, those back parts of the brain, which in detail is a little bit more in depth for the scope of this presentation, but that would be the brainstem, the diencephalon, and the limbic system primarily. Those are the first parts of the brain to develop. The most primitive, so all of our autonomic functions, breathing, metabolism, respiration, I already said breathing, heart rate, emotions, stress response system, all of these things, that forms in utero. So if you think about how a baby develops adapted to the circumstances it gestated in, right? A baby born to a mother who is under high amounts of stress, right? Who maybe didn't know where is her next meal going to come from, or where is she going to stay tonight, or is she even living in a safe environment? That brain and that nervous system develop to adapt to that high stress environment, always on alert, always ready, right? So we see higher rates of ADHD, ODD diagnoses, which I have issues with. That's a separate conversation. And that's oppositional defiant disorder. You see higher rates of things like that, separation anxiety in adoptees. Perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, I did want to mention that in particular, more from how does this affect the birth mother. They still can get postpartum mood disorders, even though they do not have a baby to take home with them in many cases, right? And so I think that's one of the parts of the experience that goes unseen is, okay, hormonally, all these things are still very much in the mix. So it's a confusing experience. The other thing of note here in terms of prenatal trauma is that attachment and bonding begin in utero through the senses. As Lyla said, I was listening to something earlier that was talking about how between 12 and 15 weeks, I believe, babies develop a sense of touch, and they can actually differentiate between their mother's touch. And they were able to see this through ultrasound. A baby will lean in and maybe put their hand out for their mother's touch on their belly, but actually pull away from a stranger. The foods that the mother eats, the sounds, the smells, the temperature, the heart rate, the sound of the blood going through the capillaries and arteries, right? All of this is innate to the baby, and to be separated from that is experienced as traumatic during the birth process, but then after too, it's interpreted by the baby as a death. The birth process, and I do recognize this is not easy to really reflect on and think about what is this experience. But this is the foundation. Adoption begins with loss, as Lyla will talk about earlier. The birth itself is experienced as a trauma by the baby due to the maternal distress, the heart rate, the pain, the discomfort, the change, the push, all of the things. And the baby believes that it's going to die. You know, it's being pulled from its source of safety, regulation, nutrition, right? And what completes that cycle is the placement of the baby on the mother's chest, where it's returned to that familiar space, calm body, safe heart rate, right? That's what completes it. And so we see these same things in babies that were placed in the NICU and in incubators too. That separation, that attachment break is traumatic for that baby. So, you know, all of these things, there are some international specific nuances here. Like I said, substance use rates, which most of us are familiar with the impact of alcohol consumption or other substance consumption on developing fetuses. These are more or less common in certain countries, but definitely overrepresented in the adoption community. And let's say I've jumped around a little bit. Yeah, all of these set the foundation for who is that child going to become, or what is that birthing parent going into the world with after this experience. Okay, Lyla?
Thank you, Kaylin. So given what I kind of talked about, the emotional development of the baby in the mother's womb, and what Kaylin talked about with kind of this maternal impact and baby impact of that prenatal trauma, it's really important to also put this lens on what we're talking about, which is international adoption from China, right? So that question of, well, what was going on that could have affected birth mothers in China, right? So I know that everybody who is on here that has a personal connection to adoption or knows about international adoption knows about China's one-child policy, and also the fact that China did end international adoptions recently, which is a point that I will get to at the very end of this presentation. I really wanted to end with that. But so about this one-child policy. So for children adopted from China who might have faced their own stressors before being adopted, understanding the connection between the one-child policy and prenatal trauma is pretty vital. So in 1980, Deng Xiaoping introduced the one-child policy in China. I actually think that it was maybe in progress in 1979. But the aim was to control this rapid population growth that was beginning. So the controversial policy relied heavily on what I just put on the slide, which is propaganda. So this idea, if you've ever seen the documentary One Child Nation, which I highly recommend, but also, you know, trigger warning, but it depicts, you know, these plays and this music and these like pictures on that were being painted on walls in China of, you know, one child is the best life and it's going to give you a happier life. But it was this attempt to stop the overgrowth of the population. So it relied also on harsh enforcements. And so those harsh enforcement measures included forced sterilizations, abortions, and really severe penalties for families with more than one child, abandoned newborns, and also this idea of human trafficking. So no fine was paid for a second child. If there was no fine paid, the child wouldn't exist. So that means that second child would not have access to healthcare or education. So you can only imagine what pressures, environmental pressures this put on birth mothers. So there's a gender preference pressure because the son was the one who would marry, but he and the wife would take care of the parents. And then familial pressure. So, you know, again, in the documentary, it talked about husbands and grandparents really pressuring and wanting that boy. Governmental pressures, right? So they're already trying to spread this propaganda saying that this is what is meant to be a happy, wonderful circumstance to have only one child. And then physical safety pressure. So, you know, having that, the idea that if they were found out to have a pregnancy and it was their second or third, would they be forced to have an abortion or would there be a forced sterilization? So the policy's harsh enforcement and societal pressures created a very high stress environment for those birth parents, especially the birth mother, right? So we just learned about that prenatal trauma piece, right? So what mom was feeling, baby was feeling. So you can only imagine the elevated cortisol levels and kind of the impact that that had on the health of the unborn child. So this elevated the environmental and emotional stress levels in birth mothers across China, which in hand, as we just learned, affected the children. So I'll continue with my notes. And if you would like a copy of my notes at the end of the presentation, I'm going to be providing you with my email address as well. So we're going to move on to the 7 core issues of adoption. So I wanted to pause before I told you what the 7 core were and kind of talk about the language surrounding adoption. So the adoption constellation covers all who have been touched by adoption. So it involves all in the process, even the broader community, right? And then we kind of narrow it down. So the adoption kinship network is the complex set of relationships that involve the adoptee, their new family, the birth family, adoption professionals, and community connections. And then we kind of have what I call the adoption triad and what other professionals call the adoption triad, which is the adoptee, adoptive parents, and biological parents. So I really think it's important to touch on this idea of what is an adoptee's vocabulary. So it's important to ask adoptees about their own terms for things like their quotation marks real parents or quotation marks adoption day, rather than assuming what they prefer or assuming what they call birth parents, adoptive parents, and the day they were adopted. It helps a lot. So I've heard some stories from adoptees who have some harsh questions thrown at them about like, oh, well, do you ever want to find your real parents? And unfortunately, I've heard adoptees being asked by therapists that question. And you can only imagine what identity crisis and what kind of feeling that might instill in the adoptee, because that's not their vocabulary, or they might not feel that way about their biological parents. So it's just really important that we cover what does the adoptee call these things, right? So ask them before we make assumptions. So I wanted to include this picture because this is kind of an updated triangle that is done by Shannon Rosia. She's done an updated version of the book of the 7 core issues. So at the heart of this model is the adoption constellation, right? So the central hub where the adoptive parents, birth parents, and the adoptee and those who work with them intersect. And then on one side, we have trauma, which is reflecting how the past experiences maybe, reflect a shadow over all of those involved. And then on the other side, we see the attachment side, which is emphasizing how crucial it is to build secure and nurturing relationships. And then we also have the 7 core issues at the bottom, which is what I'm going to talk about in this section of this presentation. So they are kind of shaped by trauma and attachment. And understanding this setup helps us see how all of these elements interact and influence each other on this adoption journey that the adoptees go through. And it gives us a kind of a clear picture of the challenges that everybody is facing in that adoption triad that I just talked about. So here are the 7 core issues. And what we're going to do is we're going to break them down. So for each 7 core, I'm going to talk about birth and first families, and then I'm going to be talking about adoptive parents, and then also about the adoptee. So the 7 core issues are loss, rejection, shame, guilt, grief, identity, intimacy, and mastery and control. So let's kind of first start the loss conversation with birth / first parents. So adoption means losing control over the decisions about their child's upbringing and about the ability to, pass down values and rules. They also give up their role of being a parent, and they give up the role of that day-to-day connection with their child. They also can miss the physical closeness they once had. And again, like I said, the chance to pass down family milestones and history. So there's a loss of connection that's both very physical and emotional for birth and first parents. adoptive parents, right? So I'm just keeping an eye on the time too to make sure I'm respectful of yours. So adoptive parents face several challenges. So they do miss out on kind of the genetic connection, like family traits and medical history, right? They feel like they probably have this loss of control over the adoptee's history prior to the adoption, right? So the early experiences in the initial bonding process, they don't have control over that. So it feels like a loss. It can feel like a loss. Sometimes expectations that adoptive parents have are disrupted by the child's past trauma that can kind of make their parenting journey a little bit different and unique. There's also this loss of privacy. So, you know, when someone goes out and has a child, you know, gets pregnant, right? There's not somebody in the room that stops you and says, no, let me ask you all these questions before, you know, you're allowed to, you know, get pregnant, right? We can talk about whether there should be or not, but they don't have that. But for adoptive parents, there's like an assessment for the adoption, right? There's paperwork, there are home studies, there are questions that really can be invasive and pretty thorough, right? And they also get these questions about the adoption journey. So when, you know, I'm out with my parents and we don't look the same, we get questions about it, right? So it is a loss of privacy. You can choose whether you respond or not, but it's this idea that you're questioned more so. Also community. So what I have also come to find is community and resources for adoptive parents could be definitely improved. And so they might feel a loss of community and social supports and resources because there might not be any in that area, especially with international adoption. From the parents that I've talked to, it's really hard for them, for their children to maybe find someone who is adopted or find a therapist who's adoption competent and understands international adoption. Also, the last bullet point, which is bonding, right? So, you know, the adoptive parents might also find that there's some attachment issues that happen along the way as the child ages, right, throughout the life stages. And it might have them question kind of their parental identity. So it's like it's a loss of bonding in a way of they might be asking themselves additional questions. And, you know, questioning their defined role as a parent. So adoptees face several significant losses.
Traumatized lives.
Okay, sorry. But so adoptees face several significant losses. So they do miss out on genetic ties, right, including medical history, family traits, and cultural background. They can also feel lost from not knowing their early life experiences and not having memories of what happened, or, you know, the pictures of the sonogram, or the, oh, you know, in the hospital, your father did this kind of language, right? They can also feel a loss of connections with their birth family, again, their birth country and heritage, and it can affect their sense of identity and culture. Community support and resources, like I said about adoptive parents, it can be lacking. You know, understanding from others. The amount of times I've heard the DNA family tree genetic stories about science projects from adoptive families. I had my own, and then friends, partners, people who really understand what it means and what, you know, what attachment issues we might have, what just what trauma we might have experienced. You know, I think we've got a great online presence because, you know, we're all over the United States. But sometimes it can be hard to find someone who has that shared experience in our day-to-day life. And identity. So there's kind of this loss of, you know, who are we? You know, loss of answers to questions about the beginning of our lives, right? And loss of control. So loss of personal information. And there's also this idea that, you know, we lost control over our life narrative at the very beginning when we were born. So I wanted to kind of pause. And like I said, everything in purple will be personal stories versus, you know, professional experience. But so three kind of brief stories I wanted to share were the they have glasses, I want glasses story. So I think it was like fourth grade, and before fourth grade, from like first grade to fourth grade, all my parents heard from me was, I want glasses because you have glasses. And they were like, why do you want glasses? And I was like, it's because I would be able to look like you, right? Because I didn't have that from a genetic component. And so I said, if you guys have glasses, I at least want glasses. Anyway, I remember in fourth grade, I was sitting in the back and the expo board. I mean, back then it was like an expo board. Everybody has smart boards now, but I couldn't see the board. And I went home and told my parents, I really think I need to go see an eye doctor because I really can't see the board. And my mom and dad looked at me and said, no, because you've been trying to get glasses for your entire life and I don't believe you. I did end up needing glasses. I wear contacts now. And to be quite honest, I wish I didn't need glasses, but just a story though of how kind of that loss did impact me and how it, I wanted to look like my parents in one way or another. Family tree. So like I said, I've heard a lot of stories about family tree DNA projects done in science. And I think it was elementary school again. And I had a science teacher who wanted to do, Punnett squares, DNA, and wanted you to bring in a family tree, but also bring in kind of what each family member looked like on the family tree. And it was just a very awkward conversation my mom had to have with the science teacher, explaining that I can bring in a family tree, but I'm not going to look like the people in the family tree, which was the point of the assignment. The point of the assignment the science teacher wanted to do was be able to do some activity and relate it back to, oh, you look like your mom and dad because of this. So that happened. And then do I have more family? So this is more of a relevant loss for me that I've kind of been grappling with and personally trying to navigate. I come from a very small family. So I had my grandparents and I had my uncle and me and my parents. And I lost my grandparents at a young age. And then I lost my uncle pretty tragically during my first year of law school. And I don't know if I have siblings. So this question of do I have more family is a story of loss and also a journey that I'm still going on. It's this idea of, if I lose my parents, who else do I have in this world, right? And this idea that I keep doing 23andMe, hoping that I might be one of the adoptees who has a similar story of meeting a sibling through 23andMe. I have some good friends who are adopted from China who met siblings through 23andMe, but it doesn't happen. So it's this acceptance piece and, relinquishing control over that I have to accept. But again, it's a story of loss that I'm still grappling with. And I always say adoption is a lifelong journey. So those were kind of some personal stories about loss that I wanted to share. Two pretty past and one pretty recent. So rejection. So rejection can actually feel like physical pain, right? So I want to kind of talk about birth and first parents first. So they can feel rejected by their community and their family and even their perception of, does the adoptee still, have negative feelings towards them because they don't know where the adoptee is, or if they have other children or family members, they could be suffering rejection and feeling the pain from the rejection by other children or family members. So for example, I know I keep using this documentary as an example, but the One Child Nation director was questioning a birth parent's decision. So it was actually a family member, and I'm not going to speak to it because, to be quite honest, I can't remember the nuance of it, but she was related to a family member who did give up a child for adoption, and the director had just given birth to her son, and she was questioning that birth parent's decision when she was making this documentary. So it's just an example of how there can be this perceived rejection by other children who are of newer generations of the family members who did relinquish or were forced to relinquish their children during the one-child policy. Society, so they could feel judged by others for the choice that they had to make to place the adoptee for adoption. But again, we're learning more about this point as more information is becoming relevant. Like I said, there was kind of the trafficking aspect, this idea that they might not have had a choice. So that point I put in there, but it definitely can be, this is an if it applied to that circumstance type of point. Government pressures and propaganda. So if they, they could feel rejected by their own government, and the government may not be supporting the search for biological children. So, they might not be out there going, oh, you know what, let's give out these DNA tests because we really want to reunite Chinese birth parents with their biological children. So that can feel like a rejection as well. And then a rejection of their own self, right? So questions about their own self decisions, like they might struggle with feelings of failure or inadequacy, or that question of maybe, could I have done more? So adoptive parents and rejection. So it could be felt by loss. So like this belief that the adoptive parents, they can't fully replace what was lost. Adoptive parents might, and your feelings are valid, right? But an adoptee's wish to connect with their origins might bring up feelings of rejection, identity conflict, right? So issues with the adoptee's cultural identity can create a sense of rejection if they feel disconnected from their adoptive family's culture. And then the adoptive parents might feel like, oh, I'm trying to pass this down because it's something that, my family did or my culture did, and they might feel rejection because the adoptee doesn't have an interest in it. And then parents own possible feelings of inadequacy or guilt for not being the adoptee's birth family. That can be relevant. And control issues. So parenting role, attachment, rejection, if you've got a child who is, I can also go into a spiel about how I feel about RAD diagnosis, but if you've got an adoptee who has a very avoidant kind of attachment style, an adoptive parent could definitely feel rejected by that. So for adoptees, right? So adoptees can experience rejection in several areas. So they might feel rejected by their birth parents, right? Perceived rejection by their birth parents, or feel a lack of acceptance from their adoptive family, siblings, friends, romantic partners, etc. And in the community, they may struggle with feeling caught between two cultures and two communities, almost like kind of like living in between. They might feel rejection from judgments and stereotypes. They might feel rejection from their own heritage. So I always give a Twinkie analogy, which is basically, I can say it, but sometimes I feel Asian on the outside and white on the inside. And so with being in between these two communities, it's almost like I can feel rejected by the Chinese community, and I also can feel rejected by, the community here in the United States. Rejection can also be felt through the fear of abandonment, issues with self-worth, and a constant search for a sense of belonging, which is ultimately different categories of rejection of self and perceived rejection from others. So shame and guilt. So for birth and first parents, shame and guilt can be deeply felt. So they may struggle with internal shame. They may, again, of giving up the child, whether that be forced or whether that have been the choice. The circumstances in China are so vast and varied. They may struggle and they have a heavy burden of regret. They may feel shame or guilt on reminders of birthdays. Maybe the government reminders, right? There have been some different changes. So 1 child to 2, and then there also was a shift from 2 to 3, I believe, and then now they're closing international adoption. So having these reminders come up could instill and could bring up those feelings of shame and guilt for birth and first parents. So for adoptive parents, it can be felt in various ways, right? So they might question if they're doing a good job raising their child. Societal pressures about biological connections can add to their worries. Not being able to control what happened to the adoptee before the adoption might actually lead to some feelings of shame and guilt because they love their child so much. And they may feel guilty about removing their child from their birth culture and heritage. I didn't highlight this in purple, but I will say that one thought that my mom had when she was taking me away from China on the plane that she shared with me, and we kind of talked about it, was she said, I felt really weird because I felt what if this baby never, comes back? I'm taking away her from this place, that the only place that she's known. And adoptive parents also might struggle to understand their child's emotional needs fully, and they might feel ashamed if they feel like they're not meeting those needs as well as they'd like to be meeting those needs. So for adoptees, it can be felt in a few ways. So they may feel ashamed of how little they know about the Chinese culture. They might struggle with lack of knowledge about their birth culture, questioning whether they should have made more effort to learn. When it comes to searching for biological parents, they may wrestle with doubts about whether they really want to find them, like shame or guilt about not wanting to go on the biological parent search. But also, if they've already searched or are searching, they could be struggling with the shame or guilt for, did I do enough to try to find them?
I have a question. Can I take the Seraphim cup sleeve? Can I take the Seraphim cup sleeve?
Oh, I can do one.
Sorry. And so they also might be kind of dealing with this identity issue, which is how am I viewed? So they can often deal with internalized guilt related to their adoption circumstances, and they could experience shame about their identity or about their past. So grief. I'm going to introduce this slide for grief and then kind of turn it over to Kaylin as well. So to introduce it, I'd just like to say that, birth and first families can experience grief through the actual loss of the child, and it's like a severed connection. It can also come in forms of like the question of, am I even still a parent, right? They could also be grieving the unanswered questions of where their child is and the loss of the future with their child. And with that, I just want to turn it over to Kaylin.
Yes, thank you. So jumping off of what Lyla said, this is a very complex experience that, and you'll hear me alternate between biological parents, birth parents, first parents, all of that. I'm referring to the same thing. It's a complex experience, and I think one that is not always spoken to very much, especially in situations where the relinquishment of parental rights was, I'm going to say voluntary in air quotes, because much of the time, what looks like a voluntary relinquishment, in my opinion, is not fully voluntary because it's necessitated by the circumstances, right? Would this person have made a different choice had they not been living in generational poverty, right? If the community could support that, adoptive parents fundraise their adoptions much of the time. Is there any such efforts to funnel money back toward biological families? Not to my knowledge, So voluntary versus involuntary termination of rights. So involuntary termination of rights, I'm thinking more situations where there might have been foster care, right? The state had to intervene and terminate the rights. That's a fundamentally different experience. As Lyla said, identity questions, identity changes. Can I call myself a parent, a mother, a father, right? If my child is out there somewhere, I hope, right, but not with me. Isolation, secrecy, and shame. I used to be a home study evaluator, and part of that work, I worked with mostly adoptive families or prospective adoptive families, but also did some pregnancy counseling as well. And one circumstance that is not uncommon is a pregnancy in which, from start to finish, no one other than the pregnant person knows about it. In many cases, that's because of shame. It's because of fear of rejection or ostracism from whatever community that pregnant person is a part of. This is genuinely a situation that many people do completely and totally alone. And so what does that mean on the other side of it, right? If no one knew that I was pregnant, where can I speak about my loss? Where can I get support from the perinatal mood disorder, maybe now that I have after giving birth, right? When no one knows that there was even a child in the first place. Lack of closure, always wondering, is that child okay? Do they look like me? Do they think about me? Do they hate me? Are they mad at me? Would they like to meet me? All these things, right? Unfulfilled hopes, the if only, as I call them. If only my circumstances were different, could I have made this work? If only I had been able to find a suitable job in time would I have been able to parent this baby, right? And then, of course, as Lyla said, the actual loss of the child, missing that person, wondering who they are. This is, and I'll get into this in a minute, disenfranchised grief is kind of the jargony term for it. And what that means is grief that is not necessarily socially recognized. And that was an idea developed by Ken Doka, who's a big grief theorist. You can advance.
Perfect.
And should I just keep going?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so as Lyla said, with these core issues, all of the triad experience all of these, but maybe in slightly different ways. So thinking about adoptive parents, the grief experience often may be that gap between what they had envisioned versus the way their parenting journey or their experience of growing their family is going. I always say all adoptions are special needs adoptions, just, be not necessarily special needs in the way that we commonly think, but because of the attachment issues, because of that attachment break, because of the trauma, because of the all the things that we talked about at the beginning. There's so many nuances, including situations in which the baby was brought home directly from the hospital, right? All of these require special type of parenting and a mindset. So that gap between expectations and reality, as Lyla said, the loss of the biological connection, there might be some grief related to the potential of having a family that can be visually identified as by strangers as a family unit, right? Loss of the imagined future plans and hopes, maybe I don't know, everyone in one family was really good at a super type of sport, and it's maybe this child is very different and not into sports at all, right? There's, as Lyla said, things getting passed down may look a little bit different. Let's see, loss of support from others who don't understand or agree with adoption. This I hear about less commonly, but I do hear about it sometimes. People who maybe had the experience of trying to conceive and carry a biological child who, for various reasons, were not able to and decided to move forward with adoption. Maybe some in their circle said you should have kept trying, or maybe that was your sign that, you were not meant to be a parent, different things like that. These are actual things that people say. So there's that too, again, very disenfranchised, very kind of suffering in silence, I think, in many ways, just because these are very sensitive issues that I think people who are not impacted by adoption don't necessarily recognize. And then this face challenges in helping their child deal with their own grief and loss while also dealing with their own grief, right? So working on both fronts is kind of a unique experience of the adoptive parents. And in many cases, some adoptive parents struggle to support the grief their child experiences because it can feel like rejection, the point that we just went over, even though it's not, right? You'll hear in the adoptee world, we always will say two things can be true. It can be both, right? One doesn't cancel out the other, and so I think really being okay with those gray areas is kind of a key part of getting through and integrating the grief of this experience. Right. And then the adoptees, and that's the side of the triad that I have the most experience working with. So if we're talking specifically about international adoption, the loss of the culture, and I've worked with kids, adoptees who were maybe 5, 6, 7 years old by the time they left their birth country, right? So they have clear, concrete, not just implicit, but explicit memories of their time there too, right? Say that, your first several years were in one country, speaking one language, eating one type of food, all of these things. And then suddenly you're taken to another country, where maybe on special days, your birthday or things like that, your family might have foods from your background, your first country, right? But you got to learn a new language, right? There's a lot of loss there, loss of biological connection, that separation, as we've talked about, the medical history being unknown. I shared in the chat, I am not an adoptee, but I'm a person who's impacted by adoption because my mother was adopted. And so when I go to the doctor, I have to write out on my forms, medical history unknown on mother's side, right? And for me, that is not something that's intensely emotional, but for many people it is, right? Just having to, okay, I can't even go to the doctor, right, without having to address that. Or Even things like Lyla mentioned, the family tree activity. Okay, well, what's another common classroom activity? We're back in school. When's everyone's birthday, right? Many international adoptees do not know their actual birthday because in many cases they were found, they were taken somewhere. There was not someone who was there with them on the day of. So even that, right? There's so many grief triggers for the adoptee. All the unanswered questions about the start of their life. Where did I come from? It's a common experience to feel like you kind of just appeared out of thin air, and most of your personal history is guesswork, trying to figure that out. Do I have siblings? Do I have, are my parents still alive? What would my life be like there? Conflicting feelings about their adoption. I've heard many of the adoptees I've worked with, especially when they get into the teen years, begin to feel a little bit of anger and sadness and a sense of unfairness about why didn't anyone help my birth parents, right? Why were they isolated? Why were they under-resourced, right? These things get triggered at each developmental stage, the reflections, the wonderings, the questions, and they build on each other. And so that's one thing I tell the parents of the kids I work with is that this will happen in bursts. This will be cumulative at each developmental stage, and there is no getting over it per se. As Lyla said, this is a lifelong process. And then certainly for kiddos who were adopted at a later age, they may have had multiple placements, multiple caregivers, multiple adjustments, right? Depending on where they were from. Disenfranchised grief, I already mentioned that, but also the idea of ambiguous loss is a big one. Pauline Boss is the one who kind of coined this idea, and ambiguous loss means physically present but psychologically absent, or psychologically present and physically absent, right? So for the case of an adoptee, that might be the bond that they feel to their first family, who is still out there somewhere, still takes up a lot of brain space and heart space, but is not physically present in their lives. That's an experience that is not talked about, but it's almost the phantom limb kind of feeling. And then just a note about childhood grief, because that's really kind of my bread and butter in my practice. Like I said, kids grieve in bursts. It's a developmental process. The wounds reopen at each developmental stage because the inner working model of what does this loss mean to me gets updated as the kid cognitively develops. That's confusing to parents. I think sometimes they don't necessarily know that that's a piece of it, but also too, usually it will come out in the kid's behavior. It's not like a child, especially school age kid, to be like, what, I'm really sad today because I'm thinking about the way my life could have been had I stayed in China, right? Whatever. Kids don't say that. You'll see this will be the kid who either has withdrawn completely, is perfectionistic, is quiet, is anxious, right? Or it will be the kid who is flipping tables in their classroom. A lot of times it will kind of split into internalizers and externalizers, hence the high rates of oppositional defiant diagnoses, ADHD diagnoses. A lot of this is grief and trauma, particularly the ODD aspect of things. And so I think that that's just really an important thing for parents, caregivers, people who love, people impacted by adoption to be aware of. Sleep issues. I saw some stat that said something like 70 to 90% of adoptees have sleep issues, like clinically significant sleep issues. Is that trauma? Is that the back brain developmental factors, that regulate the sleep-wake cycle? All these things. Grief can impact all of that. I'm just glancing at my notes. I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Kaylin. And I know you have to go, so
yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Lyla. You're doing fantastic, and thank you for all of you for setting aside your time for this very important work Lyla is doing.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we are going to continue. So we're going to also talk about identity now. So identity for birth and first families. That issue might be brought up by, that feeling of who am I? So the reality of separation between birthing and raising the child can lead to mixed feelings, right? And that kind of goes into the role and the future, right? So they're not going to be raising the child. So that it really does boil down to that word of who am I to this child? And the future, what does it look like if I never reconnect with my child? It can also, I didn't put this on this slide, but it can also speak to some identity questions amongst their own, family lineup. back in China, is there a place for my child? Like what does the family lineup look like? So the identity of even the birth family in China can look a little bit different. So adoptive parents, so issues of identity for adoptive parents, right? So there's some challenges in parenting. So they might face challenges in helping their child understand and develop their own identity, right? And then through that process, they could actually experience their own identity struggles related to being an adoptive parent. It's very real. You as an adoptive parent also go through these 7 just as much as adoptees do, just as much as birth and first families do. So the biological search, right? So issues of identity might be brought up because there's an uncertainty of how to address issues related to the child's biological background or the search for the child's biological family, right? And the issue of identity can also maybe pour into this idea of support, right? So an identity of like, so I need to support my child's journey in understanding their identity and heritage. And, it kind of makes you question maybe your own as well. I put rejection down, and I know that that's another core issue, but the issue of identity can also be felt through rejection because questions of identity may come up at various life stages of the adoptee when the adoptee is acting out and maybe saying like, well, you're not my real parent, right? That hurts, and I know that, right? But it can lead to questions of like, well, who am I? And you see that question coming up a lot of this question of who am I in this identity portion, because I think the whole triad's affected by that question of who am I when it comes to identity. So for adoptees, the issue of an identity might be felt by lack of information, so not really knowing who you are, where you came from, dual identity. So sometimes we have to navigate this complex identity that includes both our birth heritage and our adopted family's culture. And so it can create a sense of being caught between 2 worlds, which at the very end, there's a list of resources that I've compiled. You can view them from your own lens, but it's called Somewhere Between. And I think that that's a pretty valid statement for that dual identity piece of issue of identity. Issue of identity can be felt by origins, right? So this quest to understand their birth background and origins can be a significant part of their identity formation, the adoptee's identity formation, and influencing how we feel about ourselves. Sometimes I do presentations and I'm like, well, I'm an adoptee too, so I should really use the we lens. So it can influence how we feel about ourselves. And internal conflicts. So internal conflicts related to our identity, including like reconciling our personal feelings with our adoption story, can come up. So internal conflicts of, self-esteem, self-worth, which kind of goes into the last point, but really feed into this issue of identity. And self-perception. So like I said, our sense of identity can be shaped by our adoption experience, including how we perceive ourselves in relation to our adoptive family and also our birth heritage. So intimacy, and I'm gonna catch up with my notes. So birth and first families can experience issues of intimacy too, even after the adoption has happened. So trauma and separation involved in adoption can strain their relationships with each other and other family members. So remember that example I gave of the One Child Nation documentary. She's the director of that, and there's some intimacy issues that have developed between her family. Emotional suppression, so kind of the need to adhere to societal expectations or personal beliefs may lead birth parents to suppress their emotions. So you can imagine in China, it's not very common to have that, freedom to express how they feel about having gone through the one child policy era. And so that can lead to emotional suppression, which can also lead to issues of intimacy. And I probably should have said this at first, but intimacy does not have to be, I say intimacy is any kind of interpersonal relationship you have with somebody. That's intimacy, right? It doesn't have to relate to sexual intimacy. Unfulfilled parental role. So the feeling of having an unfilled parental role can also affect their sense of intimacy. as they may grieve the lost opportunity to raise their child. They may also, you know, wonder, it may affect the birth order in their family. So kind of moving forward, adoptive parents. So the issue of identity can be felt by attachment. So maybe a struggle to establish a strong bond with their adoptee, especially if they've had kind of a difficult start. Emotional distance. So emotional distance from their adoptee, often due to challenges in understanding the adoptee's unique needs and past circumstances, might also have the adoptive parents questioning their identity. Cultural gaps, the differences in the backgrounds between the parents and the child can maybe make it a little bit harder to build a close relationship. Parenting guilt is a possibility, so worries about not being good enough, that issue of identity, intimacy, and bonding hurdles. So adoptees with special needs or insecure attachment style can really affect adoptive parents in this intimacy core issue. And like it should be issue of intimacy, and the bullet point of issue of identity felt by, it should be intimacy. So adoptees, issues of intimacy can be felt by adoptees in their interpersonal relationships. So they might have difficulty trusting others due to how their start of their life happened, and they might have difficulty forming close relationships or have anxious attachment styles where they do feel there might be an abandonment, or they might be betrayed, they might be left. Connecting with adoptive parents. So adoptees might find it hard to form a close bond with their adoptive parents. It could happen. And then feeling detached. So they might feel an emotional distance from their adoptive family, which can kind of lead to issues of intimacy, navigating identity. Adoptees can struggle with intimacy as they work through their own identity, right? Like I said, adoption is a lifelong process that you are constantly learning. I mean, I'm 28 and I still feel like, you know, as I get older, my views, my own, you know, adoption journey probably will change. Emotional guarding. So if we're having trouble expressing our emotions, there's a chance that we won't feel like we can be vulnerable, which will create an issue with intimacy, right? So guarding of their emotions as a defense mechanism, making it harder to engage with those around us. So this is the last of the 7 core issues, and then we'll get into some other different topics, but mastery and control. So birth and first families. The mastery and control issue can be felt by loss of influence. Like I know we've talked about this, a lot of the core issues kind of, they overlap each other. But birth families often feel like they've lost control over the adoptee's life and decisions. There's a feeling of helplessness. There's no impact. So birth families may struggle with not having a role in raising their adoptee, the adoptee, a lack of control, a lack of impact. Again, that feeling of powerlessness and helplessness, unfulfilled hopes, and then government control is a big one, especially with this lens that we have on, which is adoption from China, because they might not have even had control over whether they had to relinquish their child, right? So adoptive parents, issues of mastery and control can be felt by, so again, the biological connection. So the adoptive parents love their adoptee so much, but they have no control over the past or over the biology of their adoptee, right? Behavioral issues. So adoptive parents may struggle with handling behaviors linked to past traumas or disruptions in their child's life, and that may lead to this feeling of lack of control, right? Triggers. So sometimes it can be hard to identify and respond different triggers, especially if it's kind of related to an adoptee's enrooted responses that are kind of prenatal or unseen trauma. And so that can feel like, you know, an issue of mastery and control, because, you know, as a parent, I know that adoptive parents, my parents, always wanted to be able to help me handle my problems, right? So it would kind of create an issue of mastery and control for them if they didn't really even realize there were different triggers that were being triggered because of the adoption. Lack of control and own emotional responses. I'll touch on this too in an intervention I'll talk about. And then, you know, you cannot control your adoptee's experience, trauma or pain. You can actively listen and support, but I can imagine it's difficult for adoptive parents who love their child so much, but they can't erase what happened at the beginning. So for adoptees, you know, we don't have control over the beginning of our stories. And so feeling like we don't have control over our medical history, our beginning, we don't know, there are unanswered questions, it can lead to a lot of, you know, dysregulation and managing emotions. So we can have difficulties in managing our emotions and responses because there's an overwhelming feeling of lack of control over our internal experiences about adoption and the unanswered questions and the no control over the beginning. And then adoptees might feel a sense of powerlessness in certain situations because reflecting on their early experiences, they had little say over their major life events. And they also, you know, don't know about some of those early life experiences. So it can definitely lead to some issues in mastery and control. So we're going to kind of segue into racism and microaggressions. And like I said, I just wanted to reiterate, if you've got any questions or if you have anything as I go, you can throw it in the chat. I won't be able to see it right away, but there's going to be a Q&A portion at the end where I really want you all to engage. Like, I want to talk to you. I want to get to know you, because some of you I've been talking to over Facebook for a while and I haven't gotten to meet you yet. So at the very end, I'll close out of my presentation. You'll get to see me. I'll get to see you if you want to be on camera. I'll also stop the recording so that, you know, there's a level of privacy if you do ask questions at the end. So just as we go, you can throw stuff in the chat or just hold it till the end. So racism and microaggression. So racism, right? It's good to kind of understand the difference between racism and microaggression. So racism is the systematic, and I stole these definitions, by the way, but it's the systematic discrimination based on race or ethnicity that can affect social, economic, and psychological well-being. So that might look like discrimination in education, hiring processes, can also look like direct racial slurs. So an example I've used at some presentations I've done in the past is someone coming up to me and saying, I hate you because you're Chinese and because you're adopted, and you're internationally adopted from China. So that would be racism. Microaggressions, they're subtle, often unintentional forms of discrimination that can be verbal, behavioral, or environmental. So subtle comments like, I mean, if I had a penny for how many times I got this question, I'd be rich, and I'm sure your kids would too. But the question of where are you really from? This idea of you're so lucky to have been adopted, which I hesitate saying this because I do understand there's some people out there that can say yes, but what I like to say is I like to hear from the adoptee. So if the adoptee feels like, I'm very grateful to be here, I'm very grateful to my parents, I allow the adoptee to explore that. I don't tell the adoptee what they should feel. So there's a little bit of a difference there. And then, you know, another penny thing for each time I've heard this question, I probably would be able to retire now, but where are your real parents? So those are kind of examples of what racism versus microaggressions are. So what are the challenges for adoptees when dealing with these two things, right? So identity. So sometimes there can be like this expectation that we're knowledgeable about our birth language, culture, history. And that can lead to identity issues, right? And also lead to leaving the adoptee to feel separated from the adoptive culture. So, you know, like if they do know a lot about their heritage and they do know a lot the Chinese language, you know, they might feel like, well, but do I really belong here in the United States, right? It's that somewhere between feeling for us. Stereotyping. So something that was brought up, and I feel like I can share it because I'm not saying names, but something that was brought up in a process group at a camp I recently was at was this idea of Asians being bad drivers. So definitely just to, you know, because we are also Asian, sometimes there's some stereotypes that are attached to our ethnicity and our race that aren't really attached to adoption, but, you know, there's still stuff we need to talk about and stuff that you can talk about with your children or with your friends for the adult adoptees in the room who are adopted and have similar experiences as you. And then inappropriate, intrusive comments. What can that lead to? It can lead to self-esteem issues. So feeling low self-worth. Where do I belong? Why is this being asked of me? It can lead to social isolation, feeling misunderstood. And then also it can lead to strained relationships. So you might be caught in a scenario where your best friends are saying these certain things and you're caught thinking, do I educate? Do I assert my boundaries, or do I end the friendship, right? Like, where do I go from here? So I think that examining these and opening the doors to these types of conversations with international adoptees, and especially adoptees from China, just will help, so that they can learn coping skills to where it won't lead to self-esteem issues, isolation, and strained relationships. So I always like to share these personal stories, and I'm sorry if you've heard them before, because there are some repeat people who I love and who are here. But COVID and a face mask. So I was at an outdoor shopping center with my boyfriend, and it is close by our apartment, about like 2 exits up the highway. If you're familiar with Georgia 400. And we were out there, and he was on a phone call. He's the property security for our apartment complex. And so he was trying to be professional and talk to a person who's living in our apartment complex. And he was really engaged with that. And this group of, it was like 2 white males and a white female came up, and they'd been drinking, and one of them came up to me, and he looked at me, didn't look at me, and started talking to my boyfriend, who was clearly on the phone, and said, "Why aren't you wearing a face mask? Like, you need to be wearing a mask. Like, why are you sitting there next to her and not wearing a face mask? Do you want to get sick?" That kind of thing. And at first I thought he was talking to me. So when he said, like, "Why aren't you wearing a mask?" I said, "Oh, like, we're outside." And then I realized he did not want anything to do with me, did not want to talk to me whatsoever. And so I felt super uncomfortable. My boyfriend was half distracted. And then he went back to the group of people, and they laughed and carried on. And it was something that affected me. And it's just an example of a microaggression, especially during COVID. Next bullet point, Alabama man and wanting to dance. So I went to Bama for my last 2 years of college and loved it, Roll Tide, everything, huge fan. But I was on spring break with my friend she was a sorority member, opposite of me. We always used to call each other yin and yang, because she was white, blonde, and she took me down to Fairhope, Alabama. And at Fairhope, Alabama, there's this like outdoor bar that you can, if you walk through the restaurant, there's kind of a dark, dingy area. And then when you walk out, there's this open area where there's a dance floor and a bar. So we walked in, and there were a couple other people sitting in the inner portion of the restaurant. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was like an Indian couple, an African-American couple, and maybe another interracial family couple. I really can't remember. But so the hostess immediately didn't ask if we wanted outside or not, and walked us into the inside of the restaurant and sat us in this corner. And my friend, being very, very upfront, said, "We're not sitting here." So we walked outside. And these 2 guys sat down wanting to talk. And one of them was interested in my friend. So she engaged with him, and this older man, maybe like 60s, was talking to me. And he was like, reached out his hand kind of, I don't know if y'all can see me, but he reached out his hand with his palm upward. And I didn't know, like, are you asking me for my like money or wallet, or like, what are we doing? And he's like, "Wow, people like you don't know how to shake hands." And I was like, "No," I was like, I didn't know you were wanting to shake hands. I can absolutely shake your hand. So I was trying to kind of play it off, shook hands. And then he asked me where I was from. I said, "Georgia." "No, where are you really from?" We did that dance for a while. And then he also went to show me his daughter, who was in a sorority. I think it was the same sorority as my friend. And he's like, "Oh, look at this photo. And notice, like, nobody in here looks like you in this photo." And I was like, "Well, okay, I can see that, and not sure why you pointed it out." But again, I was like, okay, whatever. And then he found out that I used to be a professional ballet dancer. and I did dance team in college, and he was like, well, I want to get up and dance with you. Why don't you? And then I said, no, thank you. I'm okay. And he said, well, I don't know why you wouldn't want to dance like China for me. And it didn't like, yes, like not even Chinese. And so that was kind of that interaction. And as I think I would probably label that as like microaggression and racism kind of at the same time. And then the last bullet point is my country tis of thee. So I was in school and the music teacher said, anybody who's not white has to sing my country tis of thee as my chosen country tis of thee, not my native country tis of thee. And my mom threw a fit and we all ended up being able to sing my native country because none of us chose to be here. But that's another example of maybe a microaggression. So I just wanted to share those three before we continue. So something that I wanted to add is kind of this formula I have for tough questions. So finding out the intent of the question, right? Our feelings are valid, period. But like, what was the intent behind it? So sometimes it's helpful to recognize that intent can be separate from the way it's been delivered, or they could have intended it to be harmful. How am I feeling about it? So check in with yourself. Like, am I upset? Am I sad, angry? Am I indifferent? Take a pause. I like using threes in my practice in therapy. So I'm like 3 minutes, 3 seconds, 30 minutes, but take a 3 minute or 3 second pause that allows you to breathe and kind of think about what your response options are. Do I educate? Do I assert my boundaries? Do I walk away? Right? So you can even say like, shut up, right? But at least you gave yourself the chance to talk about and think about what options do I have on the table before you responded. So that's the fourth bullet point. What are my options in responding, not reacting? So responding puts you in control of the conversation. And even if you choose to respond from anger, like I just said, you provided yourself the headspace to where it's your choice, you're in control. This is your response, and your story and your choice of how you respond. So you're giving yourself back control. I always tell my clients, we've got circles, right? Control circles. And sometimes things are out of our control circle, but sometimes we can take them and put them back in our control circle. And so this kind of tough questions skill kind of allows you to take more control over a conversation that might feel like you're out of control. So building bridges. So we can encourage open dialogue, right? So let's create safe spaces. So set up environments where we can openly talk about like identity and any incidents that we may encounter with racism or microaggressions without fear of judgment. Education and awareness, so increasing understanding. So let's spread knowledge about the experience of adoptees and the way that microaggressions can impact them. And then providing support. So we just want to ensure that adoptees have access to counseling and support to help them manage and address their experiences. And then the intervention of response versus reaction, which is kind of what I just went through. So reaction would be that split second, like snap of the finger, someone says shut up, I yell shut up right back in their face. Response would be that 3 second pause. I've gone over what my options are and I'm taking control back of the interaction. So some interventions and take home activities. So finding some local events in your community surrounding Chinese heritage and adoptee events. So cultural and adoptee identity exploration. So invite the family, invite friends, pretty cool. So some different camp experiences that I've heard about. The only personal connection that I have is our Camp China, and I definitely recommend it. There's some heritage camps for adoptive families, and also there's Adopteen, and I've heard some very wonderful things about Adopteen as well. I just don't, I've not been, I'm not involved, so I don't want to say like I personally recommend it. And also you can definitely get a copy of this presentation at the end of it. So jar of feelings. So what you would need is colored pom-poms in a jar. And you can even some adult adoptees that I work with actually really like this exercise. So you allow your adoptee to fill up the jar, but you have a discussion on what each color pom-pom represents. So if yellow pom-poms are happy, you say, I'm putting a yellow in one because of this experience that I have about being adopted that makes me feel happy. I'm putting in a blue one because of this experience of being adopted that makes me feel sad. Red is angry. So the idea of this intervention is that the jar can change. You can pull out some stuff. You can add some pom-poms, right? But it's that we're holding space for all of the feelings included, right? So Skittles activity, I did this at Camp China this past summer. It was pretty cool. But you can get a packet of Skittles. The fun size packets are on Amazon. If you order them, just know you're going to get a lot. And then a list of adoption related questions. So I do have an example set of questions that if you provide me your email address at the end of the presentation, I will send the outline and the questions with it. But identity questions could be like purple. Adoption story questions could be yellow. But you can maybe create these questions yourself, or you could, have your adoptee have some input on what the questions might be, or use mine. But the idea is that as you pull out the Skittles, you process a question in that category. So if I pull out a green one and it's identity, then I process one of the questions in the green section. It's just a cool way to, eat some candy and also explore adoption. Life puzzle. So this one was, hopefully I can say this, kind of a hit. I mean, we had a lot of people there at the family activity, but Amazon sells great puzzles where you can make your own. The one in the corner that I did, I just made it myself. But the idea is to hold space for the black or blank pieces that represent the unknown, the things that we will not know throughout our life as being an adoptee, but also hold space for the colorful pieces that show the wonderful, positive, great things that you enjoy and appreciate about your life. And this activity can actually be done by adult adoptees, young kids, at a wide range at that activity. And also in my practice, wide range of people who do it. But so the blank or colored black or whatever color you want to represent the missing pieces, and then the colored pieces for family, friends, pets, loved activities, etc. So I have like my mom, dad, I have teachers that were role models, pets, I have my degrees, I have my boyfriend, I have the missing pieces. I think one was like birth history, like medical history, birth, family, day I was born, because I don't know that. But you get the general gist. It's just a cool, fun, creative activity. Secure base and activity and totem. So for older teens or young adults or even young ones, I kind of suggested secure base activities that adoptive parents can use with their kids. So it can be done through activities as well, not just like a totem, but just things that you can do that are routine that establish kind of that secure connection between you and your adoptee. I kind of shared it, but one thing my mom did was this golden key. So I always had it. She always had it. She gave it to me when they were gone. And then I returned it to her when they got back from date nights. And then she gave it to me for my high school graduation. And I wear it around my neck now. So all I think about is my mom and my dad when I wear my key. But routine, expected, significant, and special events within the household is kind of the goal. So, kind of up to y'all, but we can take a quick break. So maybe just like a minute or so. I just want you guys to feel comfortable, situated. And then we're going to go into DNA testing. And so what I'm going to do is, if you want to start sending questions in the chat now, you can use this break to do so. Or if you just want to send some thoughts in the chat, you can, and maybe we'll come back in like 2 minutes if you want to get some water, run to the restroom. Okay. I want to be kind of respectful of your time. So I'm going to start back up. Again, this is being recorded. So if you want the rest of the recording, I can definitely send it to you. DNA testing. So DNA testing involves analyzing your DNA to get information about your health, ancestry, and traits. So kind of a simpler breakdown is health information. So if you have like genetic variations that might increase your risk for certain diseases, family background, so it might help you learn your ethnic origins and family history, and then personal health. So it can provide insights that might help doctors best choose like the best treatments for you. So normally you give like a sample of your saliva or blood and it's sent to a lab for testing. And the results can help you understand more about your health and your genetic connections. So what it may mean for an adoptee, right? So it can mean self-awareness, connection to personal history, learning about inherited traits. I think I did 23andMe and I have something like where I'm at a slight increased risk for macular degeneration. But it can also evoke some complex emotions. So you could discover some biological family. And again, this is the lens of Chinese adoption. So there is a chance that you can, I think fourth cousins or third cousins is the closest I get in that families and friends, ancestry, relatives portion. But it can evoke some complex emotions. So whether we don't get matches, it can evoke emotions related to, am I ever going to find someone? Or, what does this mean? Or, the questions of like, well, what happened to my biological family, right? And then if you do find someone, it can evoke the emotion of, well, do I reach out? How do I go about creating and establishing this connection? Do they even want to have this connection, right? So it's something that you can definitely explore with adoptees, like younger adoptees, like what does it look like for you? What would it mean for you to uncover certain things like that? What would it mean if we tried it and we didn't receive results, right? Limitations. Biological families may not have been tested. So, and it doesn't tell the full story. Like it doesn't tell you what happened at the very beginning of your life, right? So in China, I think there are certain people posting about ways that you can go back and get your DNA, blood samples left behind at different provinces, police stations, and certain biological families are starting to test more so. I say that, and I did this presentation before China closed international adoption. So I don't want to say that because I'm not sure what it's going to mean for us. Now that they've closed international adoptions, like what it's going to mean to go back and test and go back and search. It might not affect it at all. I'm just saying I don't want to speak to it and have something change in the next few months. But also informed consent. So you need to allow the adoptee to decide what the adoptee wants to do. It's so hard because even if you think that you know what's best for the adoptee, I promise you they're going to be on their own journey. And I think that allowing them to make this decision for themselves is giving them back that sense of control in which they've lost, right? Remember, we talked about control and not losing kind of the initial control over our lives. And so allowing us to make that choice is giving us back what is perceived as control. So biological family search, to search or to not search. That's the question. Guess what? There's no real right answer. So feelings can shift and change. And we've got to hold space for those who don't wish to search for their biological family. And we also have to hold space for those who do wish to search for their biological family. And adoption is a lifelong journey, like I keep saying. I have a purple box up here that says my feelings have shifted because they have. I initially wanted nothing to do with Chinese culture or heritage or my adoption. When I was like in elementary to middle school, all I wanted to do was fit in. I was that kind of kid. My parents tried to put me in to learn Mandarin, and I just was so opposed to it. I would cry if my parents mentioned my biological mom or my biological father, not because I missed them, but because I was like, why are you mentioning them when I have you? So now that I've talked about how my family is very small, I do want to find biological family because I have a fear of being left alone and not having family. which is a vulnerable thing to say on a webinar, but it's very true. So my feelings have shifted between not wanting to search and now I'm not at the place where I want to do a full out search. And I'm going to go into the next slide of how to maybe start that full out search. I'm not in that place yet. But my feelings have shifted. So your adoptee's feelings might shift. It might go from, I really want to meet my biological family to, I want nothing to do with them when they hit college, or, you know, they find a husband, or they find a wife or a partner, a life partner. Adoption is a lifelong journey. And that's probably why there's not a lot of psychological research and even therapeutic psychological research done around adoption, because it's such a unique experience for each human. We're all unique and it's a lifelong journey. So life stages look really different for adoptees. So biological family search considerations. So finding biological family members can be tough for Chinese adoptees due to several reasons. So we've got privacy rules. There are strict laws in China that can, you know, make sure that adoption records are kept confidential. You know, paperwork may have been forged and untruthful. I jumped ahead, but changing systems. So adoption agencies and local systems may have changed, shut down. There might be outdated records. Paperwork may have been forged and untruthful. The language barrier is huge. I know a lot of people have someone, they hire a searcher, so someone who can translate between English and Mandarin, or English and Cantonese. Genetic testing and limits. So genetic databases might not have extensive information on Chinese birth families, because they might be hesitant to participate in testing, or because they just might not have been given that option. Stigma and sensitivity. So the cultural stigma around adoption and personal reasons might make it so that birth parents are reluctant to connect or reluctant to test. It should be in purple, but I actually found a third cousin. I talked to her and she said, even in her family, she has some direct immediate family members who relinquished children during the one child policy. And she said that they do not want to test because they don't want to open that door again. And I know that's pretty hard to hear, pretty hard to digest, but it's a very real thing that we may have our feelings as adoptees, but birth parents have their feelings as birth parents, as well as adoptive have their feelings as adoptive parents. We have to hold space for everybody. Historical factors. So historical and political changes in China can impact the availability of adoption records, hence the closing international Chinese adoption that I've alluded to several times during this presentation that I have a slide for. So steps you can take to start your search if you want to start your search. So check in with your adoptee on a regular basis on how they're feeling. Start with a saliva DNA test, 23andMe, family tree DNA, upload to GEDmatch. Two really great projects that have started are the Roots of Love and the Nanqing Project. Those two give very great step-by-step guidelines on how Chinese adoptees can start their search. Hiring a searcher, I believe it's on the Nanqing Project's website, but they have a list of searchers that are in different provinces in China. And so you can just go on that website and scroll, and you'll probably see the searcher page, and you'll find the one that is located in your child's province. Documents to have on hand. So, you know, mine are in a safety deposit box somewhere. So maybe things to maybe look for as you start this search are certificate of adoption, certificate of birth, certificate of abandonment, finding ad. So for those adopted after 1999, which is not me, I was adopted in 96. But for those adopted after 99, you should have a finding ad, because it was a requirement in China after 99 that infants and newborns who were found, quotation marks, had to have a finding ad placed in the local newspaper. So your searcher should be able to help you with that. On a personal note, something that kind of stood out to me was looking at that certificate of abandonment word. Just might be something to process with your adoptee, or to process with your parent, or to process with another fellow adult adoptee. You know, it can evoke a certain amount of emotion. Again, resources to help with the search. So again, you can get a copy of this presentation, but there are 4 websites and then also some Facebook groups. So Family Ties Chinese Adoptee Birth Family Search, and then Journey Across Forever China Birth Parent Search. Adoption competent therapist. So one who is not adoption competent can do damage. It may not be their intent to do damage, but they can do damage, unfortunately. Look at qualifications, work history, and in this case, personal experiences with adoption. So adoption is one of those specialties where I think it is beneficial to find out if your potential therapist has a personal connection. There are so many other specialties out there that you can do a wonderful job as a therapist, but adoption is just one of those that I just ask. There's no sense in not asking tons of questions during that intake session. So there are no real programs that offer full certification to therapists, like based on that there's not a lot of therapeutic research out there on adoptees, especially international adoptees. There are trainings. So, and there is a certification, the TAC certification Kaylin was talking about, which I think is extremely beneficial. And I'm in touch with some therapists who have been trained extremely well through that. But Kaylin also has some background in doing home studies and working with the triad through, that adoption lens. And she also does have a personal connection to adoption. But like there's an EFT certification or an EMDR certification or Gottman certification that takes invest $4,000 and do, over 100 hours worth of trainings and you get certified. I'm saying there's nothing like that for adoption. So it's very important that you ask a lot of questions of your potential therapist or the potential therapist for your child. So the modalities to use with adoptees. So I mainly use ACT. The reason why I use ACT is because we as adoptees can't change what happened to us in the past. So moving from a lens of moving into, how do I align with my values? How can I practice mindfulness? How can I stay regulated? How can I, diffuse from my thoughts? How can I accept that there are going to be ups and downs in life, and how can I cope? That's a huge aspect of acceptance and commitment therapy. So I really highly recommend that one. Just being an adoptee and a therapist at the same time. CBT definitely can help. So CBT kind of works on changing negative thought behaviors and patterns, and it helps you learn new ways of thinking. So, cool things like that are like fact checking your distortion. So if you have a distortion that you're not worthy or your parents don't like you, it's like, what facts do we have that align with that thought, and what facts do we have that can challenge that thought? DBT also is great. It's great. It's skills-based. So it kind of helps you with emotion regulation, mindfulness, managing stress, interpersonal relationship effectiveness. And it's great for people who have intense emotions and struggle with self-destructive behaviors. So I lean more towards like DBT and ACT. Emotionally focused individual therapy can be great as well because it helps you explore your emotions better, and it's actually useful for working through past issues and learning how to manage your feelings in a healthier way. So that one's great as well. I do use that one too. EMDR, I'm not EMDR certified, but I do hear from some adoptees it helps. I hear from other adoptees that it didn't help at all. So really just consult with the therapist you're about to work with, see if it's the right fit for you, but it helps you process and reduce the impact of traumatic memories through using guided eye movements. And it's especially helpful for trauma and PTSD because it allows you to reframe and heal from kind of past experiences. So it actually, I stand by it. That's why I put it in the presentation under modalities to use with adoptees, because I'm sure it could work. I'm just not trained in that. But I'm sure it could definitely be beneficial. Just find the right therapist fit and see whether they use EMDR. There's actually a therapist, anybody in Georgia. There's also a adoption competent therapist. She's an adoptee herself, certified in EMDR, and she's in Sandy Springs in case you are looking in Georgia. So the recent news. So China will no longer send children overseas for adoption, and there are families in limbo. So my own personal remarks. I put out a statement on Facebook about how I feel about it. My heart really goes out for the families that are currently in limbo and who were placed with their children in 2019 and still haven't now it's like this idea of I'm never going to be able to go pick up my child that was placed with me. I also hold hope that they're able to be adopted within China and they're able to stay in their heritage and their culture and their birth country and find loving families there too. But my heart just really goes out for those families because, I saw a picture of, one little boy holding a family picture of the family here in the United States. So I can only imagine what they're going through. For older adoptees, I think it's something to think about and have a conversation about, even if your adoptee is an adult, because for me, it almost feels like we're going to become kind of like a forgotten era or generation. I kind of get choked up about it, but so excuse me, but it just feels like China shut this door. And, we don't know if it's going to be shut forever. And then, I always think about like this idea of now I'm going to be learned about in history books. And there are also some unkind, if you have major news networks, don't look at the comments. I did myself the disservice and looked at the comments, and there's some jokes about like, well, now, we won't have some Asian fetish jokes, Asian girl jokes, Woody Allen jokes. Some like I hate Chinese people, like statement facts from some people like, oh, this is a good thing. So just do yourself a favor and don't look at those comments on the major news Facebook pages. But just to close this slide is me saying, I don't want us to become a forgotten generation or a forgotten era. So I really think that I'm hopeful that we can all come together during this time and support one another, despite how we feel about the government and despite how we feel about, any personal politics, etc. Just, we're all in this boat together now. So that's kind of my closing remark for that. You can see my longer remark. I just didn't want to read it to you over this webinar, but you can see my official longer closing remark on my Facebook page, or if you want me to send it to you, I can definitely send it to you. But again, it's very complex emotionally for myself, and I can imagine it's very complex for adult adoptees emotionally in general. So some more take-home items. So these I can just go over pretty quickly, but Seize the Connection. I know Dawn and Cindy, they founded this Seize the Connection, which is community-based support organization in Tampa Bay, where all mothers and that have adopted children or foster children are welcome. So it's not specific for Chinese adoption, but I know the Carolinas retreat for STC has a lot of Chinese adoptive moms. And it's where you go, it's a weekend where actually you can do what you want, but you're surrounded by other moms who know what you're going through. Somewhere in between is a documentary. Again, you can watch these through your own lens. I'm not saying that I can agree with all of them entirely. I'm not saying that, these are just 3 that are out there. But somewhere in between is a documentary that follows 4 teens who were adopted from China, and they meet and bond with other adoptees, and they journey back to China to reconnect with the culture. And they also are able to connect with some of the children who were left behind. So that's a documentary. I think you can buy it on Apple, probably like $13. One Child Nation's an Amazon documentary. Please, please, please look at the parental guide before you show this to any adoptee who is under the age of 17. Just, I'm going to put that out there. Or just make sure that you're ready for it. It has some very poignant and sad photographs and some very, very hard facts and new knowledge. There's one portion where there's a map shown about highly trafficked areas, and I found myself teary and upset by it. So just careful with that one, but it is good because you do get to hear from birth parents in that documentary, meaning I think there's like a couple birth moms and a birth father. Found is a Netflix documentary, which is about some teenage girls who discover their blood-related cousins, and they actually travel to China all together to seek kind of identity and family history. So that's a great one. don't remember much about that one. I need to go back and watch it. But again, look over these descriptions before you view them and before you have your kids view them. So I'm going to kind of close out. Also, I just wanted to spend the time to thank my practice and Kaylin, my parents, my significant other, and the Chinese adoption community. And then also, I've got resources on this presentation, which are website resources, and then articles and reports. So you can go and click on those articles and click on those research reports and just see if there's anything that you can pull from. I just really wanted to be like a presentation that I could compile and then send off to people who are interested in seeing it. So I'm going to stop the sharing and stop the recording. Hopefully.